Have you ever felt like you were an emotional button for others? As soon as someone gets angry, you have to soothe them. When someone is sad, you must listen. If someone needs something, you must be there immediately. And you disappear in your own life. We grow up in a society that teaches us kindness means always being available. You must reply to messages immediately. You must help as soon as someone asks. You must smile even when your heart is breaking. But have you ever asked yourself, what happens when you stop? When you are no longer the one who is always ready? This is not selfishness. This is the beginning of a powerful transformation. There is a special strength in knowing when to retreat, when you choose silence over reaction, when you stop explaining, stop justifying, stop pleasing. That's when the world around you begins to shift. Those who once took you for granted become confused. They can no longer control you with their own emotions. And do you know what the most wonderful thing is? It is this. You begin to return to yourself. Don't walk away. In the next few minutes, we'll explore how Carl Jung viewed this process, not as giving up, but as a return to power. We often don't realize this, but every emotional reaction, whether a frown, a hasty reply, or a long-winded explanation, costs internal energy. Carl Jung didn't view the human mind as an unconscious reflex machine, but as a sophisticated energy system where every thought, every emotion, every action needs fuel to function. The problem is, most of us let the world decide where that energy gets spent. We react constantly without discernment. We let a careless remark drag us into argument. A disapproving look robs us of sleep. An unanswered message leaves us anxious and tormented. And so, bit by bit, our precious energy leaks away, drop by drop, each day. The truth is, most of what exhausts us doesn't come from work or external pressure, but from spending energy on what isn't worth it. Arguments that don't nourish us, explanations that aren't appreciated, people-pleasing acts that only maintain hollow relationships. Carl Jung once said, "What you resist persists. The more you react, the more entangled you become with what's hurting you." That doesn't mean you have to become indifferent or emotionally detached. It means learning to be selective, learning to retain energy within your own psychological system, learning to say no without guilt, to stay silent without feeling weak, and to observe before acting. Because true power doesn't lie in reacting instantly. It lies in the ability to choose when, to whom, and for what you respond. And that is when you truly become the master of yourself. There is a quiet yet weighty truth. Constant, unceasing presence is not a sign of kindness. It is a silent form of self-abandonment. Since childhood, we've been trained to believe that our worth is directly proportional to our willingness to serve others. That replying late is cold, refusing is selfish, and setting boundaries is heartless. But in trying to please everyone, we begin to lose ourselves. Each time we say yes while our mind screams no, each time we force a smile while our heart is drained, we drift further from our authentic self. Carl Jung emphasized that the social self, also known as the persona, is the mask we wear to survive among the crowd. We wear it to be loved, to be accepted, to avoid being hurt. But behind that disguise is a soul fading away, buried beneath the role it's forced to play. Unconditional willingness not only drains you, it also makes others unable to see who you truly are. They don't interact with your real self, but with the most convenient version of you that you created. And the cruel truth is, the more accessible you are, the more you are taken for granted. When you're always present without boundaries, you become an invisible resource. No longer a living person with feelings and needs. Abundance erodes value. What comes easy, people don't preserve. Those always available are rarely appreciated. So, stop. Look at how you distribute your energy, your time, your mind. Not to become rigid, but to begin choosing, consciously, who is worthy of your presence. And more importantly, so you stop trading inner peace just to maintain roles the world imposed on you. Don't let being easy to reach become the silent sentence that makes you forgotten in your own life. There is a hidden mechanism directing your emotional life, an unspoken manipulation cloaked in seemingly harmless gestures, Expectant eyes, loaded silences, conditional compliments, or random sulking. It's not coincidence. It's strategy. In Carl Jung's psychological world, this is the phenomenon of projection, where people assign to others the parts of themselves they cannot face. But what few realize is, the more unconditionally open you are, the more you become the backdrop for those illusions. When you don't set boundaries, you don't just absorb others' emotions. You become the victim of the roles they cast upon you. These connections are not built on truth. They are sustained by expectation and fed by your reaction. Every time you answer, every time you explain, every time you try to prove something, you continue to feed the image they want you to become. Subtle manipulation doesn't need to shout. It only needs you to respond as usual. What keeps you trapped isn't chains. It's the unconscious repetition of emotional patterns. You're stuck in your own loop, a closed circle where every reaction is predicted. But what happens when you withdraw? When you no longer follow the familiar script? When you don't respond to provocation? Don't rush to fix misunderstandings. Don't continue conversations that lead nowhere. The entire system breaks. The roles collapse. And what they see is not you, but their own void. Silence is no longer emptiness. It becomes a mirror. And in that mirror, each person is forced to face the shadow they've never dared to confront. You don't need to fight back. You just need to stop being controlled. Because when you stop playing the old game, you don't just regain freedom. You force the world around you to change its rules. There is a form of manipulation that requires no words, no harshness, no threats, yet it is profoundly effective. It manipulates through silence, through expectant glances, through subtle expectations woven into everyday gestures. It doesn't attack directly. It infiltrates bit by bit into your emotional system until you forget who you were before you had to become reasonable. Carl Jung called this phenomenon projection, a process where others cast onto you the parts of themselves they haven't accepted. But what few realize is, you're not just the target of projection, you are the curtain they use to hide their inner darkness. And the softer your heart, the weaker your boundaries, the more you become a mirror reflecting things that don't belong to you. You are not loved for who you are. You are loved for your convenience. You fulfill a role, keep the peace, fill others' voids. And in that way, you're kept not for love, but for function. This creates an illusionary connection, where you are seen through a mask painted by others, not through the truth of your essence. And not wanting to hurt anyone, you accept that exchange, only to find yourself fading in your own life. But every game needs someone to keep playing. Every act of manipulation only exists as long as you keep reacting. When you no longer respond, no longer explain, no longer enter the labyrinth of meaningless emotions, the old order begins to fall. The masks drop. Every fake layer is exposed. Not because you attacked, but because you stopped fueling the game. Your stillness forces them to face what they've long avoided, themselves. When you no longer play the roles of the comforter, the listener, the fixer, they no longer know how to interact with you. And that is the moment power shifts. You don't need to argue back. You don't need to counter. You only need to hold your space, steady, silent, unmoved. And that alone is enough to shatter the hidden mechanisms that have held you back for too long. Intentional withdrawal is not avoidance. It is a form of purification. It is a reconstruction of your relationship with the world, based on awareness, no longer on submission. And in that silence, you are no longer the one being led. You become the untouchable center of your own life. Today's world is not lacking in noise. From empty conversations to endless debates, everyone is rushing to express opinions, to respond immediately, to prove themselves right. But amid that chaos, there is a rare form of power: intentional silence. Not the silence of fear or helplessness, but one that arises from inner strength. A silence that observes, that discerns what must be received and what must be released. Carl Jung once viewed silence not as emptiness, but as a sacred space, where truth can speak without being drowned out by external noise. When you choose not to react, not to get swept into the emotional uproar from outside, you begin to notice patterns you had never seen before. Repetitive behaviors, old emotional cycles, unconscious impulses that once led you into familiar traps, all slowly become visible. And it's within that stillness that you gain enough distance to see, understand, and transcend. Others may perceive your silence as indifference, as distance, as cold detachment, but in truth, it is they who are unsettled by something they can no longer control. The imbalance created when you no longer react in predictable ways. You're no longer playing by the old rules, and when you change the rules, the world around you must change as well. Silence now becomes a sharp tool, not to harm, but to protect your spiritual territory. It is an expression of emotional mastery, a declaration that you are no longer willing to give away your energy unconditionally. Because every word, every reactive behavior is an investment, and not every situation is worthy of your capital. Only in the depths of silence can you hear your own voice. And from that voice, you begin to build a solid foundation that no longer relies on anyone's validation. There's a paradox in the journey of inner awakening. It's when you stop connecting with the outer world that you begin truly connecting with yourself. Stillness is no longer a passive state, but a space for rebirth, where what was once drowned out by noise finally reemerges in clarity. Carl Jung believed the process of individuation cannot occur amid the noisy crowd. It requires a retreat, not to escape, but to re-establish internal order. In that space, you are no longer dictated by the constant demands of others. You no longer have to become the convenient version for anyone. You are no longer forced to react, explain, or prove. And in that moment, you begin to reclaim your spiritual sovereignty. Prolonged silence can feel like distance and at times be misunderstood, but it is the necessary separation to realign with your true self. When you stop absorbing distracting signals from outside, your mind becomes clearer. From there, what was once buried beneath busyness and the need to please begins to surface. Inner voices once ignored now become guiding stars. True silence, however, is not merely the absence of sound. It is awareness of your own energy. It's the process of learning your limits, defining your boundaries, and choosing what deserves your attention. No longer reacting from habit, but acting from consciousness. This may make you appear unpredictable to others. Those who are used to the always available, easy-to-read version of you now face a self that is no longer easily controlled. That unpredictability is not distance, it is depth. A depth not everyone is refined enough to access. And from that separation, a new form of power emerges: wholeness. A state in which you are no longer dependent on recognition, no longer define yourself through external perception, but become your own source of fulfillment. Inner transformation cannot stop at awareness. Understanding without action is just another way of deceiving yourself into thinking you've changed, while in reality you're repeating the same patterns. The key lies in moving from realization to conscious adjustment. Each moment you delay a reaction, each time you hold back a word instead of rushing to respond, is a step forward in reshaping your life energy. There, you are no longer a reflex of circumstance. You become the one setting the rules for your own life. Carl Jung emphasized that true spiritual development does not happen through compromise. It always requires a form of inner discipline, not rigid control, but conscious selection, choosing what is allowed to enter your mental space, what must be blocked before it penetrates your psychological structure. Withdrawal now becomes more than a behavior. It becomes a symbol of self-mastery. When you decide to no longer be the always available person, you are resetting the operating system of the world around you. You no longer let others' emotions dictate the schedule of your psyche. And most importantly, you no longer feel the need to explain your absence. Because once you begin living from the inside out, you realize true value needs no approval. Your silence already carries the message. You are no longer a puzzle piece in someone else's blueprint. The world may not be used to your absence from old roles. There may be resistance, judgment, or misunderstanding. But that's not a sign of error. On the contrary, it is the expected reaction of a system breaking apart, because you've withdrawn the energy that once kept it running. When you choose to live from inner depth rather than external expectation, You don't just free yourself from unconscious mechanisms. You invite a new form of freedom, stillness that does not waver amidst the storms of life, and wholeness that needs no agreement. There are moments in the inner life when all external noise fades, and what remains is a single silent question. Who am I when I no longer serve someone else's role? That question does not arise in crowds, but in solitude, where you stop conversing with society and begin dialoguing with your soul. When you decide to retreat from emotional turbulence, what appears first is not peace, but emptiness, a silence you've never known, as if you've lost something familiar but outdated. But in that very emptiness, the layers of the psyche begin to peel back. Masks that once concealed your essence begin to fade, making way for inner clarity. Carl Jung once said, "The journey back to the original self requires temporary separation from the collective, a necessary isolation so you no longer define yourself through others' gaze or response. Only when you stop performing do you truly see who's been living inside you. The loneliness you feel now is not a loss. It is the space of restructuring. There, you're no longer swept into old roles, no longer reshaping yourself to fit in, but begin rebuilding your soul's framework on an inner foundation, no longer borrowed from the outside. Still, that rebirth does not unfold peacefully. It may come with resistance, confusion, and sometimes the feeling of rejection. But remember, the distance of those who no longer recognize you is simply the result of you no longer fitting the role they were familiar with. The miracle is that from within that silence, a new version is forming, one that no longer waits to be understood, no longer needs to fit into external expectations, but lives according to its own frequency. And it is precisely when you no longer need someone to validate your existence that you begin to truly exist. No longer scattered, no longer compromising, just pure presence, unnegotiated. When you stop being the one who's always there, the outer world may shake, but the inner world begins to still. A silence not empty, but full, carrying all that you once abandoned while chasing after someone else's gaze. From what once seemed barren, something primal rises. You no longer distorted by expectations, no longer dependent on praise or approval. You no longer need to stay to be loved, no longer need to explain to be understood. Your presence, even in silence, carries the weight of someone who has chosen to live authentically. Some will walk away. There will be criticism. There will be moments of loneliness like moonless nights. But remember, you're not losing them. You're returning to a more complete version of yourself. And that is the first step toward true freedom. This journey is not easy, but you are not alone. Every step you take inward is a step toward the pure self that Carl Jung once described, self-governing, uncompromising, and no longer ruled by reaction. If what you've just heard has touched something deep within you, click subscribe and follow the channel, because the next videos will take you even further, into the light you've only dared to touch in dreams. And if you're ready, leave a message. I choose to return to myself.